welcome to another edition of Law and Democracy, a podcast of the election law program at The Ohio State University. I'm Steve Huefner, the Deputy Director of the election law program at OSU, and I'm delighted that today on our podcast, we are joined by Tony Gaughan, who is the Kern Family Chair in Law at Drake University, who is a visitor here at the OSU Moritz College of Law this semester, and also by my OSU colleague Ann Ralph, who is the Associate Dean for Academic Affairs here and the Morgan Shipman Professor of Law at OSU. Plenty of things to talk about yet again with our time today. Where should we start?
Well, Steve, our topic to lead off today is early voting. There have been a number of recent news stories about the challenges the Republican Party has had in getting its voters to participate in mail-in voting, as well as the fact that early voting has started in several states across the country, and each day more states join in and begin their election process here in early October. And then finally, we'll discuss the blue shift and some changes to our perceptions that early voting leads to Democratic votes being tabulated later in the election process, that in some states actually those votes are tabulated at the very beginning. So that's a big picture what we're talking about today. And my first question to lead us off is, how does early voting change our elections from the days when the vast majority of votes were cast on a single day, election day?
There really is quite a difference today from the historical practice through most of the country's history because of the large percentage of votes that are now cast before election day. And, you know, one of the things that does is complicate campaigning for candidates. Back when the number of people who were voting an absentee ballot some period of time before election day was very small, candidates and their campaigns were able to anticipate that they would be continuing to advertise, continuing to be reaching voters in other ways, and then generating their get out the vote efforts, all targeted at election day. And now they've got to consider an election period of several weeks to a month or more in a few states, and figure out how to deploy their resources to maximize turnout and participation and support for their candidate or position across that wider interval. So that's one reality, and it really is worth recognizing how much more early voting is occurring today. And I'll just mention in that regard that the 2020 election saw this dramatic increase in early voting, and that was largely because of the way in which states were responding to the COVID pandemic. And those responses were trying to find ways that voters could cast a ballot more safely than being in a crowded polling place on election day. And that occurred in many states through a dramatic increase in mail-in voting, which is a type of early voting, if you will. And it also occurred to some extent by more early in-person voting that could be conducted with, you know, more space around the voters and not have to crowd into precinct polling places on election day. So both of those things in 2020, in response to COVID, dramatically increased the proportion of early voting. The signal so far, or the preliminary reports so far this year, suggest that the amount of early voting will be less than in 2020. Of course, it's impossible to know how much less until we are done, but you can say that the amount of early voting that's occurred by this point, this election, is less than the amount of early voting that had occurred by this point in 2020.
Steve, that's such an interesting point you raise about sort of complications for the campaign and dealing with this election season rather than election day. And I wonder to what extent you think the sort of mishmash of for both of you, the mishmash of different access to early voting across the country may complicate things for campaigns in their attempts to educate voters or confuse voters. You know, lots of states, mostly Western states, allow mail-in ballots or send mail-in ballots automatically to voters. There are a number of states, I think the majority of states, where all voters can request ballots by mail. And then there are some states that only allow mail-in voting by excuse. And so for a campaign to sort of figure out how are we maximizing our outreach to voters in their individual state, how are we educating voters about what they can do? That seems to introduce that mishmash of rules. It seems to introduce some confusion and extra work.
It certainly lends to the problem of public misunderstanding. You know, I think the campaigns are pretty good at adjusting to those differences. And in particular, the presidential candidates and their campaign committees and workers and volunteers are targeting just a handful of states that really are going to matter to the Electoral College results. And you can be sure they know exactly what's happening in each of those states and what the differences are and how to try to adjust their campaign strategy for those particular states. When it comes to other races beyond the presidential race, they are by definition just state or even local contests. And so the candidates well know what's happening in their state and when the voting can begin. And the problem of public misunderstanding of those rules is, I think, greatly diminished once we're beyond talking about the presidential race. Anyway, that's my off the cuff thinking about that. But you know what? Sorry, go ahead, Tony.
Well, I was just going to say one of the interesting aspects to mail-in voting is that it changes the implications of an October surprise throughout America, and at least in the 20th century into the 21st century. Campaigns often worry that there will be some development, late-breaking development, maybe internationally in the last month, that would change voters' minds. But with so many voters casting ballots early in October, late-breaking news may not necessarily have an impact on the election like it might have 30 or 40 years ago. So I just find that to be one of the unintended second-order effects of this, what I see as a very salutary development, that increase in opportunities to vote early for voters.
Well, and you can see that candidates and their campaign committees really are, in many places anyway, working hard to get that early vote locked in and to get it locked in early, you know, as soon as it's possible. In part for that reason, you know, just to make sure that their voters have locked in the support for that candidate. And of course, one reason is because of the potential they might change their mind because of an October surprise or whatever. But in addition to that, aside from the October surprise concern, it's just valuable to the candidates to have a vote already in the can, if you will, or already in the ballot box. And to then be able to redirect the remaining resources you have to voters who haven't voted yet.
It really is remarkable to think about how targeted campaigns can be now in this era, not just in terms of identifying where like the Republicans or Democrats are, but identifying who's already voted and who hasn't. And so now we can concentrate our resources on the people who haven't. It really is extraordinary.
It is. And in a number of states, I was sort of looking at some nationwide statistics. In 23 states, voters can register on election day. So that really opens up even more opportunities for campaigns to reach non-registered, you know, folks who are not yet registered, to get them to vote on election day as well.
Now, there's another dimension to the question you asked at the outset, Tony, about how the increase in early voting may have changed the way in which elections are conducted. And that is that in some states that have a significant amount of early voting, the election workers are not allowed to actually begin processing that early vote until election day. I mean, Pennsylvania is sort of the poster child for this from the 2020 election, when there was such a dramatic increase in mail-in voting all over the country, and that included Pennsylvania. And Pennsylvania's law said that the election workers couldn't begin counting those ballots until election day. And couldn't begin processing those ballots till election day. The processing of mail-in ballots is more cumbersome than the mechanics that surround in-person, in-precinct voting on election day. If you go to your precinct on election day and you get checked in as a registered voter in that precinct and are then given a ballot or an electronic voting machine to cast your vote on, that vote can be quite readily tabulated with the unofficial results at the end of election day. If you are sending in a mail-in ballot, the processing of that ballot has some extra steps. Opening the transmission envelope, checking the authentication on the transmission envelope, making sure it comes from an authorized voter. And when all of those steps are done, then the ballot itself inside the envelope can be placed in a stack, ready to be counted by a tabulating machine or run through a tabulating machine. But the preliminaries of making sure the internal ballot can be counted take some time. And in some states, that meant that those early mail-in ballots weren't able to be counted with the unofficial result on election day. And where a race was close enough, or where the number of mail-in ballots was large enough to affect the outcome, then we didn't have the results, even the unofficial results, for a time. And that was also something that sowed a little bit of confusion and could again.
I'd be curious, Stephen, and why do you think there are states that still today that have laws that don't allow the processing to begin until election day? What would the policy rationale be behind that?
Well, it's a holdover, I think, from a concern that let me back up a step. I mean, we talked a few minutes ago about how campaigns want to know all they can about who's already voted in order to then try and target their get out the vote efforts on the low hanging fruit, or what is the remaining lower hanging fruit, if you will. Campaigns might also figure out how to redirect their resources if they had some sense of a preliminary result, if you will. If they started to get a sense that the votes that had been cast so far, as early votes go, tended to run in a particular direction in a particular state, then the campaigns might focus their resources in a different way than if they didn't know anything at all about how those early votes were coming in. And so it's always been the case that the states have a law that precludes any preliminary tallying and preliminary release of partial results or noon results or whatever, even though many states make quite accessible to campaigns voter lists that show who has voted by noon or whatever the reporting hour might be, but not how they voted. So we don't get any tallying until after the polls have closed. And there was a concern at some earlier points, I think, that processing of mail-in ballots might occur in such a way that insiders could know for whom those ballots had been cast, and that information could leak. And so, at some earlier point, I think, I could be wrong about this, but I think it was just a judgment. Well, let's just hold off doing any processing until after the polls have closed, and then we have no risk of that. Now, that may have been a sensible choice when the quantity of mail-in ballots was pretty small. It's not such a sensible choice today, and instead, the way to alleviate the problem is just to prohibit the actual tallying of the ballots, even though you can do the pre-processing. And that's what many states do, is permit the pre-processing of the mail-in ballots, just not the tabulation, or even letting the ballots be run through a tabulator, but just prohibiting any human from accessing the internal memory on the tabulator until the polls are closed.
That's exactly what Ohio law does and permits, is for absentee ballots to be processed before the polls close. They can even be scanned by automatic tabulating equipment, as long as the count isn't revealed. So the counting can happen when the polls close, but all the processing steps can happen early. So we will see Ohio numbers very quickly, immediately after the polls close. We would see Ohio absentee numbers being
It certainly
reported,
does
for
make sense to
instance.
me that election authorities would not want results to be revealed before people have an opportunity to vote. It is off the top of my head, but I want to say that in 1980, Jimmy Carter conceded before all the voting was done in California and the West Coast. And I believe it caused a lot of consternation in the Democratic Party that affected down ballot candidates because people said, oh, we lost, so I'm not going to bother to vote. And I also remember an inverse of that, Karl Rove. I believe this is the case, that Karl Rove was very bitter at the networks in 2000 for calling Florida for Gore before, I think, Pensacola, because Pensacola is in the central time zone, and the call was made before whatever the cutoff was in the central time zone in Pensacola. And he claimed, I've seen him say, that he thinks that led some Republicans to not vote in the last hour or so. So there is a real concern there.
And that same concern, I think, is what now means that the networks that share some exit polling data that they can use to call the races have agreed, I think, just as a matter of good public policy, and serving the public, that they don't release any of that internal polling, exit polling information until the polls have closed everywhere.
In a particular state, yeah.
Well, or anywhere in the country for the presidential election, I think. That's what they do in terms of calling the race overall.
Right.
And we certainly continue to see what we saw in 2020, which is that Democrats tend to be more interested in voting early, and Republicans tend to prefer to vote on election day. And there's a piece in the New York Times yesterday that looked at registered voters and who's requested mail-in ballots and what the response rate has been. And it certainly indicates that Democrats continue to have a big lead in early voting, despite a push within the Republican Party in battleground states to get Republican voters to vote early. And so I guess my question is, why do you think there's still a level of distrust on the part of Republicans about voting early, even when the Republican Party leadership is urging Republican voters to cast ballots early?
Yeah, this is a hard question, and I don't have a good answer. I don't think. It's interesting to compare some of the historical dimensions of absentee and early voting. Until the last 2 decades, I think that a lot of the research seemed to suggest that it was more Republican voters who were using absentee voting. Now, this was before absentee voting became widely available to any voter who just wanted to choose that voting method. I'm talking about an era when absentee voting was restricted to people who would assert they had a good reason to need to vote by an absentee ballot. And maybe this is just a matter of some basic demographics, that it was voters who tended to support Republican candidates who were more inclined to be able to take advantage of an excuse-based absentee voting system. But that's all flipped now. And you can really trace this flip, I think, to the 2004 election. The 2004 election saw a number of states with some pretty long lines in that year's presidential election. I mean, voters were lining up for whatever for all the races, but it was a presidential election year. It was the first presidential election year since the difficulties in Florida in 2000. A lot of states had new equipment they were using, and lines in some places were quite long. And so after the 2004 election, including in Ohio, a number of states tried to figure out how to avoid the really long lines we'd seen. And one response to those long lines was to make mail-in absentee voting or early in-person voting, which in many states, including Ohio, is technically a type of absentee voting, available to anyone who wanted to use it. And so 2008 was the first presidential election in which we saw Ohio and several other states have this widespread availability of early or mail-in absentee voting. And that shift to a no excuse required form of absentee voting generated a dramatic increase in the number of people using it. And for whatever reason, it seems that it's now being used more by more Democratic voters than Republican voters. One little angle of this, I just can't say, and maybe political scientists could give us a better response on this point. But one piece of this was in the 2008 presidential election. There were some pretty successful get out the vote efforts, relying on the availability of early in-person voting on weekends to, in particular, encourage people to go from their places of worship on Sunday to a polling place.
Souls to the polls.
Souls to the polls. Well, and Souls to the polls was particularly targeting Black churchgoers who were enthusiastically participating in the presidential race with Obama as one of the two major candidates. And I just don't know how much of the shift from a more Republican-leaning electorate using absentee voting to a more Democratic-leaning electorate using early voting traces to the Obama candidacy in the 2008 and Souls to the Polls efforts that occurred in many places around the country.
I wonder if either of you think there's any valence to the idea that just sort of rhetoric around voting security might be different for people who align with different parties. So folks may feel if they are concerned about election fraud and absentee voter fraud, they might themselves feel more comfortable voting in person, or feel that that is a more trustworthy way to vote because it creates that trail that they can actually observe at the polls. I'd be really interested to talk to political scientists to see if that's something that, it is actually could be shown.
Yeah, certainly my intuition is that that is a major part of this, that the Republican voters consistently show much higher levels of concern about voter fraud, and Democratic voters show much higher levels of concern about voter suppression. And what's interesting too is I know there are a number of studies that have found voters' view of the legitimacy of the election is directly connected to whether or not their side wins. But when your side's also the incumbent, I haven't seen a study that addresses that, but I've got to have a sense that if your party controls the apparatus of government, that should give you a higher level of confidence that the election will be conducted in a way that your votes will be counted. And maybe in a way, the Trump campaign in 2020 missed an opportunity when you think about, right, he was the incumbent in 2020, and he only lost the 2020 race by something in the neighborhood of 70,000 votes when you look at the three key states plus Omaha congressional district, that if they had flipped, he would have gotten 270 instead of Biden. And it's pretty easy to imagine 70,000 people in those key states who wanted to vote for Trump, who waited until election day, but then something happened in their lives and they weren't able to get to the polling places in time. If they cast mail-in ballots, he very easily could have been reelected. And I certainly think that's a lesson the Republican Party has taken from it, but it's striking their difficulty persuading Republican voters to change their voting patterns, at least a critical mass, to drive up Republican turnout.
Yeah, and we really have seen inconsistent messaging from especially the sort of national Republican Party, where on occasion those national leaders have been encouraging their voters to take advantage of early voting wherever they can. And at the same time, there continue to be a lot of exaggerated claims made about the the lack of reliability in mail-in voting. Now, I think it's always important for us to be careful and transparent about these things. It's not that mail-in voting is error-free or fraud-free. There are ways in which mail-in voting is a less secure way to vote, both as a matter of voter error that an individual voter can make that means their ballot won't be counted, as well as a result of manipulation that's done intentionally as a way of fraudulently skewing the totals. The amount of fraud, though, that occurs in mail-in voting is quite small, and the claims about its vulnerability are greatly exaggerated. Frankly, I think we ought to be more attentive to the problems of voter error with respect to mail-in voting that can prevent a ballot from being counted. And of course, there's a relationship there, because one of the ways in which states work assiduously to try and reduce the possibility of fraud in mail-in voting is by having extra requirements that the voters have to comply with to verify their eligibility. And the more requirements there are as a way of reducing fraud, the more likely it is that a voter's not going to comply with all the requirements and not, cross all their T's and dot all their I's, if you will, in how they fill out the paperwork, leaving them essentially unable to cast a counted vote. Now, states have worked to try to develop more sort of streamlined and voter-friendly processes, and also to make publicly available to the voters history of the progression of their mail-in ballot through the system. They get notice if they choose to go online of when it's mailed out, and they can get notice of when it's been received, and they can get notice of whether it's been processed as a countable ballot or not. Those things are all to the good. But there clearly remains an exaggerated sense of the problems with mail-in voting. And that's, I'm sure, part of why some voters don't use it.
I have to say, I have voted early, but when I vote early, I've always voted in person early at the local elections office, because I really do like this sort of civic act of going with there are other people who are doing the same thing as me and seeing the local elections officials and submitting my ballot. There's just something about it where I sort of hear in the back of my mind the Star Spangled Banner playing, or God Bless America, as I participate in this democratic act. And I'm so thrilled that because of mail-in voting, our voter participation is so high. But I also think there really is something to be said for that communal experience of being with other people voting together.
Oh, I couldn't agree more. And that's one of the reasons I really enjoy either voting in person on election day or voting early in person. But I will say, I mailed my ballot in the 2020 presidential election with my other family members. We all took our ballots together and mailed them together, and we would sort of check every day to see if our ballots had been accepted and processed and everything. So I do think, Steve, besides the fact that those developments, like being able to track your mailed ballot, are all to the good in terms of reassuring voters, they also give that sort of sense of civic participation, some sort of ceremony.
Well, I agree. I love the civic community feeling that we get when we vote in person. But I'll also add another reason to vote in person, whether it's early or on election day, is because you are assured then that your ballot is going to be counted. The problems I was describing a minute ago with failure to properly authenticate your mail-in ballot just don't exist if you go in person to an early voting location, those poll workers there, election workers, are gonna determine whether you're eligible to vote or not. And if they determine you're eligible to vote, then at least in most jurisdictions, you're going to then vote the same way you would vote on election day using, an optical scan ballot or a touchscreen machine that then has recorded your vote, and it's now in the system. And you can walk out of that early vote location confident that your vote is going to be cast. So I tell people all the time that it's nice that we now have as convenience the ability to vote early. And in most places, not all, but in most places, you can pick between going in person somewhere early versus using a mail-in ballot. And if you have the choice, going in person is a preferable way to do it. The civic community feeling that you two are describing, plus the extra security that your vote is now part of the total. But it's not always possible for you to do that. And partly that's because there are a few states that now conduct their elections entirely by mail. But it's also because some voters actually require an accommodation that means they can't vote unless they can mail it in without going to the polling place. And COVID was a great example where the number of voters who, in terms of their own health and assessment of their own risk to their health, just were not in a position to go in person to cast their ballot. And I've been wrestling just the last few days with the problem that North Carolina or Western North Carolina now has.
Yeah.
Because of the impact of the just horrendous flooding that Hurricane Helene's aftermath brought to that part of North Carolina, where the infrastructure there is now devastated, and we're less than 5 weeks from election day, and early voting's underway now in all kinds of places. So, how do states respond to this type of issue? And it's not even easy for North Carolina to figure out how to do even just mail-in voting, because the infrastructure is now so weakened that the mail system is, I'm sure, days, if not weeks behind schedule. So election workers there are scrambling to figure out how to set up temporary polling places and early polling places in temporary locations, and to make mail-in ballots available to people who don't have a home anymore to which they can send the ballot. And all of this is then non-traditional voting, the kind of voting that in recent years we have tended to see Republicans be more skeptical of, or not just skeptical, but actually attacking as unreliable. And yet they're going to need that. And North Carolina is a swing state, and Western North Carolina is a part of the state that has more Republican voters. So figuring out how to make voting work under circumstances of crisis is something that Republicans in particular really need to be engaged in thinking about.
Absolutely. It's really kind of interesting where this happened, because election law scholars, as you both know, for years have warned that a hurricane or an earthquake in other parts of the country could potentially be extremely disruptive and would have a disproportionate impact on a state or a single state like we're seeing here. But it was Florida historically that, at least in most of the forecasts, it seemed like Florida would be the state that potentially could see this situation with South Florida getting hit by a hurricane, and that might, on or immediately before election day, that might have a distortive effect in the outcome of the election. And it turns out to be Western North Carolina, which would not have been on my short list of places where I thought could be a natural disaster that could affect, a certain level, potentially even the outcome of the presidential race if it came down to North Carolina's electoral votes for Harris or Trump to get to 270. So to me, it just underscores that wherever you are, if you're an election authority or you're a member of the legislature thinking about making voting easy for your electorate, you can't take for granted, wherever you are, that you're not going to have some sort of unforeseen event is going to put your system to the test.
And I think COVID, arising in the spring of 2020, there were a lot of primary elections going on at that time in courts, and election officials had to deal with that. We are well on notice that election officials and voters need to have alternate plans for crises, whether that be weather or public health or other things like that, based on the last 5 years.
Yeah. And that's such a good point too about COVID. It is amazing to me to think that the 2020 election held during the worst pandemic in American history, certainly the worst since the Spanish influenza in the 19-teens, still saw record turnout. We still end up with 158 million people voting, the highest turnout rate since McKinley Bryan 120 years before. So to me, that's something I take heart from, that we had this event, this global catastrophe interfere with the election, and yet our system in the end proved resilient. So that does give me optimism, a sense of cautious optimism.
Right.
Thanks for that, Tony. I'll endorse that view.
I think cautious optimism is a sensible place to be in general. Maybe not when it comes to some stock investments, but in general life, I think it's a good
All
thing.
of the American people and our resilience. I think that's really fair.
I know another thing that we had contemplated, and I think you mentioned, Tony, that we might talk about that relates to the varieties of ways in which voters today are able to vote, and how those means of voting change from election to election and are different from state to state, and they're sometimes in response to particular crises and so forth, is that for one, is, as we've said earlier, that the point at which any given state has even its unofficial results relatively complete can vary from state to state. But one dimension of that variation is that in a lot of states, what we've seen is what some of us have come to call the blue shift, in the sense that the unofficial results as of election night are often sufficiently incomplete, in the sense that there remains some sizable number of either mail-in ballots that have not yet been included in the unofficial count, or some number of provisional ballots cast on election day, but not yet determined whether they can be included in the count yet. That once those absentee ballots are processed, or once those provisional ballots are processed and included in the count, the results differ from election night in a way that in many states has tended to favor Democrats. That's the blue shift notion, is that the numbers have shifted from election night to several days later, when these other ballots are included, in a Democratic direction. There are more Democratic ballots that have now been counted. And that's a reflection, at least in some states, that those mail-in ballots have been tending Democratic, and the provisional ballots tend Democratic. And it's important for the public to understand that. To understand first that the totals released on election night are still partial. The extent to which they're partial is going to vary from state to state, depending on how much mail-in balloting they still haven't counted, and depending on how much provisional balloting they've had on election day. And the point at which those election night unofficial results get updated with what are still unofficial but more complete results will vary from state to state. Some states are going to be processing provisionals faster than others, or be farther along in processing their mail-in ballots that weren't ready to be counted on election day, as we talked about earlier. So it's just worth making everybody more aware of those dimensions of the mechanics of our processes and how they vary state to state.
Steve, I think that's such an important point, and it's one that, I've heard you make before, and I've heard our colleague Ned Foley make before, that sort of just because we don't have a final tally on election night doesn't mean there's anything to distrust about the numbers that eventually are tallied. And I, wonder, we've had a lot of good feeling on this call, a lot of belief in the, in cautious optimism. What are some ways that folks who are knowledgeable about this election cycle and election process can communicate that information to the public so that they can understand and have confidence in elections, even as in our, up to the minute 24/7 news cycle, we want answers right away?
Yeah, I think part of it, Anne, is the public getting used to elections taking a couple of days to resolve, or more than a couple of days. Certainly we saw in 2000 because of litigation. But 2020, I remember being on pins and needles for days after. And just the fact that we had an election that wasn't involved, I mean, was involved in litigation at the state level, but nothing like Bush v. Gore. And yet it was taking such a long time to tabulate. I think the newness of it, the novelty of it, sort of inevitably generated skepticism. Was either side whichever side lost was going to have just naturally a certain level of resentment. But what's interesting is historically, certainly in the 19th century, well into the 20th century, in close elections, it was common for the outcome not to be known for days afterwards. In a way, maybe it's just that we were spoiled in the second half of the 20th century with all these blowout elections where you could tell by 11 p.m. Eastern or midnight Eastern that Reagan had won in 84, Clinton had won in 96. And just a consequence of a razor-thin election, a razor-thin polarized country, a razor-thin divide means people are going to have to be patient in a way that as Americans are really not used to being. So maybe we'll end up in blowout elections again for the next couple of decades, but I suspect we're going to have really close elections for some time to come. So maybe we just need the public to get familiar with this and see times where their side wins when an election plays out over days, for people to have more confidence in the system.
But you ask a hard question, Ann, is what else can we do to help the public who doesn't spend all their professional life thinking about these questions the way we do, to be sufficiently aware of these details that they will not be prone to distrust our election system because of these idiosyncrasies, if you will, or because of these dimensions of how it works. Media needs to play a big role there, and I know all of us keep trying to encourage the media to provide this kind of information, and I think they're doing that, but still it's not getting spread as broadly as would be desirable.
And in fact, some of the processing steps that, before tabulation that take so long are what make our elections, especially mail-in ballots, reliable, right? It takes longer because of the system of checks that is in place.
Right. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, it's a great point. And I think it needs to be emphasized to the public by election authorities.
Well, it's been another fun conversation. I know we're coming up close to our time. Tony, do you want to take us through a response to last week's trivia question and then give us a new one?
Yes, absolutely, Steve. So I'm sure everybody's been on pins and needles waiting for this answer. The trivia question for this week is, where did the lion's share of President Abraham Lincoln's campaign funds come from during his 1864 presidential reelection campaign, which was the most expensive in history up to that point? And the surprising answer is state, local, and federal employees of the government. So for the first 50 years of our nation's history, the vast majority of campaigns were self-funded. But President Andrew Jackson in the 1820s brought in the spoils system, whereby government jobs were given out to supporters of the candidate who won the election. And that was true at the municipal level as well, and state level, as well as at the presidential. And in return for getting the government job, you were expected to kick back a percentage of your salary to your party for use in party building activities, including running campaigns.
A
And
good old shakedown, huh?
that's right, a legal shakedown, a legal quid pro quo deal. And indeed, Lincoln was a master at that. So Lincoln's victory in 1864 was made possible in no small part from money paid in by government employees to the Republican campaign coffers in 1864. So bottom line is money has always been a big part of politics in the United States. And on a related note, our trivia question for our next episode is also about campaign finance. And here it is. What was the monetary limit set by federal law on individual contributions to presidential candidate campaigns in 1972, the year of the Watergate break-in? So what was the contribution limit set by federal law on contributions to presidential candidates in 1972, the Watergate break-in year? I think our viewers might be surprised to find out the answer during our next podcast.
Terrific.
Find out.
Well, we'll look forward to our next opportunity to be together. But for now, let me just extend appreciation to each of you. Tony, Ann, thanks for being with us today. And until next time, this has been Law and Democracy.